Alice began to approach Margaret, extended her hand to one side, and with a look full of hatred gave her a strong slap on the face. After giving the slap, Alice clenched her teeth tightly and remained silent. Upon witnessing this act, the maids were in shock. One of them started pointing at Alice with her finger and called for the head butler. He began to enter the main hall, clenched his fists tightly, and upon seeing Margaret lying on the floor, called for the guards and asked them what everyone was doing. Due to the slap, Margaret fell to the ground. She put her hand on her face, turned her head towards Alice and asked if she was out of her mind. Alice clenched her fist tightly and responded to Duchess Margaret that it was she who was out of her mind. With a look full of hatred, she clenched her teeth tightly and revealed that she knew that she had tried to kill Cyan. Margaret moved her hand away from her face and couldn't help but be left open-mouthed. She didn't know how Alice knew this. She tried to stay calm and not appear suspicious, but despite this, she began to sweat. With a surprised look, she asked Alice if she had any evidence that she had tried to kill Cyan. Alice started staring at Margaret and explained that she had just confirmed it for her. According to her, this was true since she was asking for evidence. Several guards entered the main hall and surrounded Alice. Margaret began to stand up and asked her how she dared lay a hand on her when she didn't even have evidence. Alice simply remained silent. Margaret extended her hand to one side and decided to do something about it before things got out of hand. With a serious look, she began to shout and ask the guards what they were doing. She gave them the order to take Alice out of here. Upon hearing her order, the guards started running towards Alice and prepared to attack and take her out of here. One of them apologized to Margaret. Although at first Alice stayed still, then she turned her head to one side and seeing that the guards were approaching, she decided to do something about it. The blue-haired guard tried to catch Alice, but she jumped and dodged the attack. She appeared above him, extended her hand towards him, and prepared to strike. The guard tried to catch her but ended up hugging the air. He was in shock. With a surprised look, he began to wonder what was happening. Just before the guard could assimilate what had just happened, she kneed him hard behind the head, causing him to open his mouth and lose consciousness. She brought her hand to her face, started staring intently at the guards, and used the elemental spirit ability called Undine, causing a blue mana ball made of water to start forming in the palm of her hand. She descended to the ground, extended her hand towards the guards and launched the mana ball at them. Just before the guards could even get ready, the mana ball transformed into a burst of water and attacked them, making their bodies be thrown backward. Margaret couldn't believe what her eyes were seeing. She started trembling with fear, and with a confused look began questioning if Alice had just used spirit magic and how she was able to take down the guards so easily. Alice began to approach her, clenched her fists tightly, and revealed that the guardian knight of Cyan had confessed everything. Margaret put her hands on her chest to defend herself and asked Alice not to come near her. Alice started staring at Margaret in the eyes and mentioned that he had said she was responsible for the assassination attempt against Cyan 2 years ago. She asked if she really thought she could get away with it if Cyan remained silent. Margaret was left speechless but still decided to stay calm. She began pointing at Alice with her finger and asked if she truly believed the words of those inferior beings over hers. She didn't know if Alice had lost her mind. Alice approached her and with a serious look, called her by her name, Margaret Erzit, and asked her to be quiet. She decided to tell father about all this. She advised her to prepare for the consequences. She began staring intently into Margaret's eyes and shouted that she was finished. While the guards were recovering from Alice's attack, she turned her back on Margaret and started walking away from her. She watched as little by little she was moving away and remained silent. She started looking at the ground and decided to vent a little, calling Alice stupid bitch. She knew that she was still unaware after everything that had happened. While she was sweating like crazy, she began to stare intently at Alice and with an evil smile revealed to her that Duke Villarth cared about nothing but that child. At the same time, Alice went to Villarth's office and told him everything that had happened. Noticing someone had entered, he slightly turned his head back, and with a calm look explained to her that he already knew Margaret had tried to kill Cyan Vert. He asked her what there was about it. Alice couldn't help but stay in shock, while a drop of sweat was falling from her cheek. With a confused look, she asked Villarth what he meant by this. His own son had almost been killed. She couldn't believe that this was the only thing he had to say. Villarth was standing in front of the window, turned his body towards her, and explained that he had no intention of making excuses. He thought it would be fine as long as Cyan was okay. Alice lost her composure, extended her hand to one side and revealed to him that Cyan had to face 6 official knights. He would have died if it weren't for his knight named Brian Kendrick. Villarth started to look at Alice and with a smile asked her if she really believed that Fool had saved Cyan. He revealed to her that Brian was basically an idiot. He was an errand boy for the knights. Upon hearing this, she couldn't help but be in shock. With a surprised look, she asked him if he was trying to say that Cyan had taken down the 6 official knights. Vert began to walk towards her and came to the conclusion that she didn't know Cyan at all. He approached her, took out a red envelope, began to extend it towards her and asked her to take it. With a surprised look, she started to look at the envelope and asked him what this was. This envelope was red in color and had an imperial golden seal. Vert, who was holding the envelope, explained to her that this was an invitation to a banquet of the imperial family. He couldn't go, so he wanted her to go in his place. Alice took the envelope with both hands and began to inspect it. With a serious look, Vert asked her to go and relax and also added that she didn't need to worry about Cyan. She was somewhat confused as she didn't know why he was saying this. He revealed to her that Cyan was stronger than she thought. After saying this, he decided to return to the barracks. Alice couldn't help but stay in shock and start wondering if Cyan really was that strong. The Duke left and closed the door. Alice, who was holding the envelope with one hand, started looking at the door and remained silent. Some time later, she left the Duke's office and began walking down the hallway. While walking calmly with a serious look on her face, she started wondering if she really didn't need to worry about him, remembering that he was only 13 years old. At that moment, a pink-haired woman wearing knight armor appeared and caught Alice's attention. Upon hearing her voice, she started to look to the side and couldn't help but begin to wonder who she was. It didn't take long for her to recognize her, and upon doing so, she began to smile and her eyes filled with joy. She recognized her as Cecilia. Cecilia, who had both hands on her abdomen, began to look at Alice with a joyful gaze and welcomed her back with a smile. Although she tried to stay calm, she was unable to. She lunged at Alice, gave her a hug, closed her eyes, and while crying, asked her where she had been all this time and also why she had never sent even a letter. Although at first Alice was somewhat surprised, then she understood how Cecilia felt. With a joyful look, she apologized. She was Cecilia Reen, a high-ranking knight of the Knights of Light. She had been the exclusive maid, teacher, and friend of Alice. Alice took Cecilia by the shoulders, moved her aside, and decided it was time to change the scenery. Cecilia, who had her hands resting on her abdomen, was somewhat confused and asked Alice what she meant by this. Alice took out the red envelope that the Duke had given her, closed her eyes, and with a smile, decided to go together to the Imperial Palace. At the same time, somewhere in a forest, there was a black carriage. The person inside was none other than Nana. Now she wore maid's clothes. She approached the window glass, placed both hands on it, and was amazed at how beautiful the outside was. She saw a deer, opened her mouth, started laughing with excitement, and unintentionally began to wag her tail from side to side. She was not alone. In the carriage there was also someone wearing an elegant black dress. This person was none other than Cyan. With a serious look, he asked Nana to put away her tail. Upon hearing this, she closed her eyes and started growling, causing her body to begin emitting an evil aura. But immediately after that, she became happy again. She clenched both fists, started flapping her tail and wings until they disappeared and began laughing. Upon seeing her behavior, Cyan couldn't help but feel somewhat confused, but even so, he began to smile. He didn't know that she could hide parts of her body in this way. Now he felt safer walking outside. He asked Nana if she had forgotten what he had taught her. Immediately, she changed her attitude. While she had one hand resting on her knee, she placed the other on her chest, closed her eyes, and with a smile called Cyan young master and introduced herself as his maid. She opened her eyes, started pointing at herself with a finger, and with a smile told Cyan that she was maid Nana. Cyan put his hand under his chin, and while he was sweating, he felt somewhat disappointed. He started to look at her and couldn't help but feel worried. He felt that she was going to cause problems since she was too excited. At that moment, the carriage suddenly stopped. With a serious look, Cyan began to look back and couldn't help but go on alert and start wondering what was happening. He leaned out of the window and asked the driver, who was Brian, why he had stopped the carriage. Brian started looking ahead with a surprised look and remained silent. In front of them were several armed men. Brian turned his head back and with a serious look revealed to Cyan that several bandits had appeared. The leader of the bandits, who was a man with orange hair and had a large scar on his face, began to smile, stuck out his tongue, and asked Brian to hand over everything he had. While Cyan was looking at the bandits, he started closing the carriage window with his hand, and seeing that they were just simple bandits, he asked Brian to get rid of them. Several seconds later, he closed the window, and Nana, who was sitting in front of him, became somewhat confused and asked what was happening. Cyan, who had one hand resting on the arm of the seat, placed the other on his knee, began to look at the floor, and responded to her that nothing was happening, adding that some insects were in the way. Just before the bandit leader could give the order, someone appeared and using a sword cut his neck. Their leader, who was laughing like a madman, became somewhat confused. The person who had attacked the leader was none other than Brian. While his eyes were shining and with one hand he was holding the sword, the body of the bandit fell to the ground. Seeing that their leader had fallen, the bandits couldn't help but be left open-mouthed and start sweating. They decided to do something about it. They all drew their weapons, jumped up, and prepared to avenge Fernando. Brian started looking up and seeing that they were ready to attack, lowered his head, sighed, and decided it was time to try out the new technique. Just before the bandits could attack, he opened his eyes, and while his eyes were shining, he used the technique called serial slash. He began to swing his sword with speed and precision, and in the blink of an eye, launched some powerful slashes towards them. Several seconds later, he grabbed the sheath of the sword with one hand, with the other hand on the hilt, and began to sheath it. His technique was so powerful that in a blink of an eye, the bandits lost their lives. Their corpses fell to the ground. Brian, who was holding the sheath with one hand and gripping the hilt of his sword with the other, started looking at the ground and remained silent. He opened his eyes and with a proud smile thought that the weak Brian was no longer weak. He had become stronger. Cyan began to get angry and asked him to get moving immediately if he was finished. Upon hearing this, Brian got back into the carriage, started driving again, and responded with an understood. At the same time, someone brought a large stack of reports, placed it on the table, and informed that this was the list of people who were going to attend the banquet. This was Sarika's office. She was sitting in the chair, and while she was reading the reports, she thanked the woman. The woman, who had her hands resting on her abdomen, explained to her that there were many more people than usual this time. She asked Sarika if it wasn't better to postpone the plans. With a lost look, Sarika began to look down and responded to her that this had to happen now. While a drop of sweat was falling from the woman's cheek, she started looking at the ground and asked Sarika if there was a reason why she wanted to hasten the assassination of Drenian Nephiles. Sarika rested her elbow on the table, supported her head with her hand, and while holding the report with the other hand, began to read it. She replied that Nephiles was disgusting, a rapist who only went after married women using his powers. According to her, he needed to die as soon as possible. She picked up another report in which there was a photo of Nephiles. She started staring at the photo and revealed to the woman that this bastard was her fiancé. Upon hearing this, the woman couldn't help but be shocked. She picked up another report, in which there was a photo of a girl with blue hair. She began to bring the report closer to her face and was somewhat surprised to see that this child would also attend the grand banquet. With a surprised look, she began to wonder if this was true. This child was a rare genius whose elemental statistics were all 20%, although she could not attend many lessons due to her fragile body. She was the granddaughter of the Garam Mage Association's head, Raijan's Rainreaver, named Lunav Rainreaver. Sarika started to stare intently at Lunav's report and couldn't help but be surprised. As this girl had never really shown herself in society, she didn't know why she was going to attend the grand banquet. The woman who was standing in front of her table revealed that she had heard that the president of the association had told Lunav to attend. Upon hearing this, Sarika couldn't help but be shocked. With a disturbing look, she began to question what the president was planning. She did not have a good feeling about this. Something was definitely going to happen with this banquet. At the same time, in the city where the grand banquet was going to be held, Cyan and the others arrived. While everyone was walking calmly, Nana extended her hands to the sides and couldn't help but be amazed. Brian, who was walking beside her, started looking around and concluded that the roads here were bigger. Cyan, who was behind them, simply remained silent. Nana was so distracted that she bumped into a man. The man, who had both hands in his pants pockets, started staring intently at Nana, clenched his teeth tightly, asked her who she was, and also told her to watch where she was going. Nana began to move away from the man and apologized. She placed her hands near her chest, started looking intently into the man's eyes, and with a tender look, asked him what she should do to make it up to him. Upon hearing this, the man couldn't help but start blushing like a tomato. He closed his eyes, put his hand behind his head, started laughing, called Nana young lady, and told her it was okay. Nana, who was an unconscious child of how people really were, began to point at the man with her finger and told Cyan that people here were very kind. He couldn't help but feel somewhat disappointed and thought that he wasn't kind. He asked her to stay away from him immediately. He turned his head to one side and with a serious look remembered that she didn't know much about the world. She needed to be more cautious with people. According to him, this was bad. Brian, who was next to him, became somewhat confused and started sweating upon seeing what was happening. He began pointing at Nana with his finger and asked Cyan to look into Nana's eyes. Upon hearing his voice, Cyan snapped out of his trance, started looking at Nana with a puzzled expression, and began wondering why Brian was asking him to look into her eyes. He listened to him, and upon seeing what was in front of his eyes, he couldn't help but be shocked. Nana started to look at Cyan and told him that she was hungry. Her pupils had returned to normal. While her body was emitting an intense aura, she began to stare at Cyan with a hungry look and told him again that she was hungry. Seeing that her body was emitting an aura, he thought this wasn't good since people were going to find out everything about her. Cyan entered in panic, started pointing at Nana with his finger, and gave the order to Brian to send her to a restaurant immediately. Brian did not take long to realize what was going to happen. He started running towards her and responded with an understood. He picked up Nana in his arms, lifted her into the sky, and started running towards the restaurant. Cyan was somewhat confused. He couldn't believe that all this was happening just because of hunger. He came to the conclusion that this wasn't good. Several hours later, in some restaurant in the city, Nana was sitting on a chair. In front of her was a table with a mountain of plates. She put her hand on her belly, closed her eyes, and with a smile thought that this was very delicious. Finally, she felt relieved. Brian, who was behind her holding a plate with both hands, started to look at her with a surprised look and couldn't help but be shocked to see that she could eat so much. On the other side of the table sat Cyan. While he was eating, he couldn't help but be shocked to see that she had eaten so much. It was good that he had brought plenty of money. He came to the conclusion that raising a child was really difficult. At that moment, a powerful blue-colored mana appeared. Upon feeling this mana, Cyan was somewhat confused as he did not know whose strange mana it was. A girl with blue hair appeared. Her body was the one emitting the strange mana. She began to smile and told Cyan that she was delighted to meet him. This girl was none other than Lunav. She approached Cyan and with a smile asked if he was Cyan Vert. He simply remained silent because he did not know who this girl was. Lunav started to stare into his eyes and began to smile. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.